Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 12. We'll be talking about advertising and public relations in this three-part series of videos. Very quick history of advertising. We could probably spend an entire semester just on this, but just covering some of the very basics is that advertising actually, like language, goes back to ancient Rome, and they have found evidence of very early advertising of particular bottles of fish sauces and wines that were branded with certain names. In fact, the photograph there on the page is from a particular brand of wine in Rome, and it was represented in a mosaic. So they were able to identify brand names even as far back as then, and even toys that were created during ancient Roman times that were named after popular athletes of the time. Kind of probably the first endorsement type advertising we've seen, like Michael Jordan for basketball shoes. And then we're going to skip way ahead to the invention of the modern printing press in the 1440s, a time of Johannes Gutenberg and other people, and where the very first ads that were printed were pasted to walls and then eventually found their ways into newspapers. So we're jumping several centuries there just in one slide. The 1660s was another seminal period of time for advertising. It's a time when a lot of ads were placed trying to encourage Europeans to come to America and colonize it. There's an example of one of those on the screen here. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that immigrated to America at that time, hoping to take advantage of the bountiful New World, were kind of lured there and then ended up as indentured servants for tobacco raisers, timber cutters, and fur harvesters. This is a sort of a thing that's happened throughout history in many different civilizations and countries. Even Kansas itself was settled by people from larger cities back east that were encouraging them to, businessmen in Kansas were encouraging people to come there and find a new way of life in Kansas, and that's how a lot of the Midwest, the prairie states, got settled because of these same kinds of promises of bounty and good, and sometimes they found that and sometimes they didn't. We talked about the penny press and newspapers and other movements towards industrialization in the 19th century. That led to a surge in advertising, and people started paying more for ads because they realized with circulation numbers going far higher as more and more newspapers are printed more cheaply, they would pay more to have ads placed and then make the sale of their goods and services much more substantial. And so timed with that were the trend in newspapers and later on in magazines where advertising actually supported the publication, not so much sales, especially sales on the street. I may have mentioned this before, but the average publication, newspaper especially, doesn't really make very much money from subscriptions or street sales. That's just a way to kind of get the product out there to the public and a convenience factor. Most of the money raised for publications in this country and other countries is raised through the sale of advertisers. So advertising and advertisers pay the bills. It's worth pulling out a little bit of talk about P.T. Barnum. I think most of you have heard about P.T. Barnum and a founder of the Barnum and Bailey Circus, which is actually coincidentally winding down this year. It's a long history. P.T. Barnum started as someone who was writing ads for a theater back in the 1840s, and then he became a showman and owned this circus. And he used a variety of placement of advertising in various places and stunts to promote his businesses. He, of course, ran newspaper ads. He would send bands of musicians around in the streets with advertising on the drums. He would do any kind of street banners to get people attracted to the circus. He would do any kind of stunt activities he could think of to draw attention and draw crowds to these events. And this is where, he came up with the so-called mermaid, which was really kind of made by nailing together two other dead animals that weren't mermaids. The bearded lady, who turned out to be a man, Tom Thumb, and the other large animals that were part of a circus. And here's an example of one of the ads there. He always tried to include himself, a picture of himself, in a lot of the ads, along with some of the spectaculars that were part of his greatest show on earth. And he was very much a self-promoter in the style of a lot of modern-day people. He wasn't always ethical about what he advertised or how he advertised, but it was his desire to get people in the tent or under the tent and looking at the stuff and buying whatever products were available at the time, drink and things like that, and then paying to see these attractions. So that actually is closely mirrored in one of the 4 PR basic approaches we're going to talk about a little bit later when we talk about public relations. So more about advertising. There's a bunch of early advertising entrepreneurs. I'm going to point out a couple. One of them is Volney Palmer. Remember that name. He founded the first U.S. advertising agency in Philadelphia in 1843. So a picture of him over there. And his big dream, or his big idea, was he actually was the one who started hooking up potential advertisers with newspapers instead of just having advertisers not know really what they were doing and newspapers not really knowing how to sell it. He started bringing those two groups together. And an extension of that, in the 1880s, George Rowell made his actual living by buying bulk advertising space and then reselling it. He also started a really influential advertising trade magazine called Printers Ink, and there's a picture of one of the covers there on the screen also for you to look at. So these two people were entrepreneurs in a sense that they brought customers and the people who were going to sell advertising together and did it in a way that was profitable to them by bulk buying of newspaper advertising. We're going to talk about brand names again at the end of this PowerPoint, or this presentation, but I want to kind of have you think back to the way things were way before our time. If you think of the old-fashioned country stores, people bought things in bulk. They would go to a country store or some kind of a... My great-great-grandparents had a country store in Oklahoma back before it was actually Oklahoma, back when it was still unsettled territory. And pickles are a good example. There weren't really many brand names until about the 1880s. So you would go to the country store and you'd sit down and you'd say, well, I want a pound of flour or 10 pounds of flour. I want a half a barrel of pickles. I want 16 yards of muslin and then that was that. Everything was sold and shipped in bulk. So that gave way to branding, which is putting a product or company's name on a thing and selling it and trying to develop customer loyalty for that particular brand. So I've got an old pickle barrel here next to a jar of branded traditional German barrel pickles. And that kind of illustrates the change from the older style way goods were sold without any particular style of advertising up until about the 1880s in America, and the more modern approach that we all know today. Now, I did say earlier that branded advertising was available as far back as ancient Rome, and that's true, but this wasn't common in the United States until starting about the 1880s. Advertising was once considered unseemly, and that simply means people who advertised were kind of on the same par with used car dealers nowadays. It was thought that you shouldn't do that it was wrong to advertise a product because it should sell itself on its own merits. So you see an example here. I found a nice picture of generic beer. It actually says generic beer on one of the cans. and other sorts of unbranded type of beer. But now, if you look at the world of beer, for example, beer has gotten so customized and expensive. Here's an example of an ale that comes pre-prepared in its own little crate, little box, and it's shipped. And beer itself can sell for a single bottle for quite a bit of money, if you know anything about that stuff. So as the 1880s progressed and throughout the 20th century, advertising and branding became a lot more popular. And the reason was giving someone a brand to rely on. They would use the product. They'd say, oh, I like Kraft whatever, macaroni and cheese. They would say, well, I associate that with a product I like. Maybe it's higher quality than some other products. And so that helped pay the bills. That helped establish quality standards. And as a result of that, advertising branched out to now include things like jingles and catchphrases and mottos. Some of you who are based in Wichita and are old enough might remember or know the Starlight Theater jingle. Or you might remember the Nike logo, Just Do It. So these are kind of things that, and I'm sure some of you can sing the Spangles jingle, although I won't make you do that, and I won't make you listen to me sing it. So as branding came along in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, people start relying on labels and certain things to decide whether or not, forms of advertising, to decide whether or not they want to buy that product. Advertising has also been used as propaganda throughout the centuries, and this is just one quick example. It became really big in the World War I era, 1915 to 1918 or 19. Patriotic advertising was used as propaganda, and the most famous example is this original rendition of the Uncle Sam poster, I want you for the U.S. Army, enlist now, from World War I. Since then, every war we've been in, or every conflict America's been in, there's always some form of branding, usually patriotic branding or advertising, to get that war, to encourage the popularity or encourage the American people to support it. That hasn't always been true. It wasn't true during Vietnam, for example, and it hasn't been necessarily true of some of our more recent conflicts, although even in some of the Afghanistan conflicts and things like that, there was a certain amount of patriotic advertising, patriotic songs, patriotic statements associated with some of those. So let's talk more about that at some point. More about sponsorships and endorsements. The book talks about how that began in the 1950s and 60s and has continued to this present day. I wanted to use a few more current examples. But basically, a sponsorship is when a company sponsors or pays for the advertising for a television show or TV series, for a movie. And that's done in many different ways. In the old days, in the 1950s, as we talked about when we talked about TV, they would simply say, we're the Gillette company. We make men's shaving blades and things like that, and shaving cream. And this is Gillette Comedy Hour, or this is the whatever radio hour. That became much more prevalent and then fell off because as we've discussed, the TV networks wanted a little bit more control over the content of their TV shows, and so they started doing commercials instead of having people sponsor entire television shows. But if you think now about TV shows, Hollywood movies, and even radio, they all use sponsored ads. And this one here from Brazil is Coca-Cola was one of the sponsors of FIFA matches in Brazil in 2014. So that their logo is all over that. An endorsement is similar. It's usually a celebrity who uses a product and tries to become part of the advertising in order to help the consumer say, well, if Usher guy has this MasterCard, then I must have a credit card with his name on it, his face on it too. And there's an awful lot of celebrity endorsements, particularly in the world of sports and entertainment. Not so much politicians and things like that. And it may be a TV commercial where somebody comes on and talks about somebody you know really well from a movie or from a TV show who's suddenly a spokesperson for a product. And in its simplest form, that is a celebrity endorsement. They are extremely popular. They were always popular, but they've gotten even more popular as time's gone on. I want to talk about what the book calls the creative revolution. In the 1950s, but mostly in the 1960s, there was a move away from sort of straight salesmanship type of ads, where somebody would show up and say, hey, we have a great product here, buy it, and here are 5 reasons why you should buy something. Instead, kind of in line with sort of the social tumult and the creative splurgers in the late 50s throughout the 60s, there were more creative and anti-conformity ways to sell products through advertising, instead of going back to those kind of straight, boring sales type techniques. If you are a fan or you've ever watched Mad Men, or you want to go back and watch that television series, it's off the air now, you will see that that is precisely done during the era of the early 1960s, from about 1961 or 2 to about 1968 or so is the time frame for that TV series. And that show, in addition to all its quirky characters and all that cool stuff that they do there, and all the fashion you see from the 60s and things like that, was part of that creative revolution era of advertising. And this is when they're coming out and trying to do things a little differently. You know, various characters on the show are hawking new approaches, like approaching women for advertising, doing new kinds of products and things and advertising in different ways. I've shown a couple of examples here. I Like to Buy the World a Coke, which is a television commercial that I think aired in about 1969. And you should go on the internet and search for that and try to get to listen to the commercial and see it. Of course, it looks very dated because it was shot back in the late 60s. But it was simply, I think they just gathered 150 young people on a hilltop in Italy, and somebody had written this song, and the original song was called I Would Like to Teach the World to Sing, but they changed the words a little bit, and it's kind of a statement of the 1960s. You know, it's kind of like hippies on a hilltop is what I always thought of it when I watched it when it came out. And it's shot from a helicopter, and it gradually pulls back, and you see this mass of young people kind of creating this commercial that was way different than the standard Coke commercials of the time. The book also talks about Dodge Fever as a series of commercials in the 60s, and here's an example there. They combine cars and women, which one of the techniques in advertising is that a lot of things sell, some better than others. Sex and romance tend to sell really well. Animals sell really well. Humor sells really well. And so there's a Dodge Boys print ad there. And when Volkswagen was trying to shake its image of Volkswagen was created in Nazi Germany in the 1930s or 40s, I believe. They were trying to develop a whole new creative campaign in the 60s. And so they ran a series of these ads, and you can find a ton of them on the internet, that make fun kind of the fact that the car was small, and it was lightweight, and it was dubbed the Beetle. And one of the things that they did was this ad which said, if you run out of gas, it's easy to push, which shows a normal-sized guy able to push a Volkswagen car. And so people fell in love with Volkswagens. They had to own them. They had to buy them. If you were in the 60s and you had a Volkswagen and you had a VW van, and you could paint it psychedelic, then you're ultimately cool. So read a little bit about the Creative Revolution. Start looking at these kinds of ads and looking back into that world that Mad Men, the TV show, portrays. And you'll find you get as interested in the actual advertising campaigns as you do the characters in the show. Now, advertising has had its problems over the years, and from about the late 80s through the 1990s, there were starting to be some problems in advertising. People were getting tired of brand loyalty, even though that it's companies that spent decades building up brand loyalty. they were going back, and one of the reasons why generic beer came out, for example, was they were trying to find just basic products. They were tired of paying for all the advertising and branding campaigns that went into that added to the cost of their products. Economic depression in the 1980s and the fact that it has come back now has forced people to force advertisers to cut what they spend on ads, and then of course we are all tightening our belts and have tightened our belts for a number of years now because we can't necessarily afford the brand products that we used to. So the advertising field has trended away from trying to do really fancy commercials toward marketing, promotion, and what I call concept branding. The book didn't use that term. But when I want to give you an example there, you see the Just Do It and the Swish. That's obviously a Nike ad. We all know that. But when they first started advertising Nike shoes that way, they didn't explain what Just Do It meant or the swoosh was. For months, commercials in print and on TV, you would watch a TV show and they'd go to commercial, there'd be a black screen, and at first they just had a swoosh. It would show up on the screen and it would fade out for about 10 seconds and that was it. And then they added Just Do It and they added them together. And for quite a while, months as I recall, people had no idea who the product was or what they were advertising. So when they finally did unveil it, it had already become popular, the Just Do It swoosh. That's not that many years ago that they created that. So there have been other, what I would call campaigns where people used, it was a car, and I can't remember the name of it because it ended up not being very popular, but where they simply would use a catchphrase for 2 or 3 weeks and then a month or two, and they finally unveiled the car. And but the Nike campaign, a concept branding, which is what I call that, was very successful. Okay, so now the rise of digital advertising. Obviously, here we see it all the time on social media, blogs, the internet, smartphones, and now the book talks about a trend toward. I'd say it's already here in some respects. We're now seeing advertising on video games and other new locations. The book didn't talk extensively about some other, what I call other site, S-I-T-E, locations for advertising. But among them are, have you ever seen a shrink-wrapped car with an ad around it? Those were a fad for a while, and I still see them occasionally. A lot of unusual outdoor advertising. Thin billboards that are driven down the street that are maybe a foot thick, and you can see through them from either side. They're towed by a car or by a trailer. Lots of other ways that people are still seeing advertising in old school ways, whether it's dropping down from the side of a building, but now increasingly everything we do digitally, when we get our news, when we get our entertainment, when we watch our TV and our smartphone, whatever we do, that advertising is there. And sometimes it's there to an extent that it really bugs us. But it is still in its infancy as far as developing digital advertising and actually will pay the bills the way advertising has paid the bills in other older forms of media in years past. So that ends part 1 of chapter 12. We'll come back and welcome you to part 2 when you get a chance. Thanks.